what I'm talking about tonight is an interesting study that was performed by researchers at the Cornell Lab and published recently in November last year. So to begin with, these researchers asked a really big fundamental question, which is, what are the evolutionary origins of language? How did humans develop the ability to assign totally arbitrary meanings to sounds to make what we call words? It's a pretty big question, right? And what does that have to do with birds? Well, Darwin had a hypothesis about this question, and he said, I cannot doubt that language owes its origin to the imitation and modification aided by signs and gestures of various natural sounds, the voices of other animals, and man's own instinctive cries. In other words, our innate sounds, our screams and grunts and clucks, may have been the basis of learned language. But was Darwin correct? Well, what would help us to know is if we found an intermediate state in which it can be seen that an animal has taken an innate call and taken it into the arena of learned communication. So along comes a study published in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution with a really terrible name, Learned Use of an Innate Sound Meaning Association in Birds. But it was actually quite interesting. So what the researchers focused on was bird sounds in response to brood parasitism. And most of you know that brood parasites are birds such as Eurasian cuckoos, cowbirds, that lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. Usually, often birds that are physically smaller than they are. And that leads to the pathetic spectacle, as illustrated in my little sketch here, of a tiny bird parent feeding a giant mutant baby. And in this case, an African Cape Robin chat feeding a red-chested cuckoo baby. Now, brood parasites often destroy the host's young, their own young. So in response, many host bird species have evolved defensive mechanisms against brood parasites. So one of these defense mechanisms is a special call the host bird makes when they spot a brood parasite, such as a cuckoo. And this call seems to summon other birds to attack the cuckoo and drive it away. So what the researchers did was they gathered spectrograms of birds' brood parasite alarm calls from all over the world. They did this both by direct reporting and by mining the database Xenocanto. And what they found was very interesting. They found that the brood parasite alarm calls were really remarkably similar across a number of species around the world. And these species, these calls are sort of a repetitive whine that is made up of a bunch of compressed frequency bands. I guess I don't know. But if you look at the blue squares there, you can see how similar these brood parasite alarm calls look. They just look like a series of flat lines there. And I'm just going to play a couple so you can hear what it sounds like. That was a tawny flanked prinia, and this is a splendid fairy wren. So you can see the similarities between these calls. So, given the similarity between these calls, the researchers went on to ask, how innate is the response? How instinctive is the response to the call? Well, in field experiments, they found that when a nesting bird makes this whine call, upon seeing a cuckoo, it attracts a large number of other species. And so this entire circle is all the bird species that were observed in the field at the time of the experiment. And the dark pink indicates all the birds that were attracted to the sound of the nesting bird making this whine call. And you can see that across songbirds, it was really a large number of different species were attracted, including the green arrows indicate 2 species that don't even host brood parasites, and therefore shouldn't really be worried about these brood parasites. So the attraction to this call was quite universal, at least among songbirds. And then they found that even when they switched up line calls between species from different continents, that you would get basically the same response. So in Australia, at the nest of a scrub wren, the researchers played the line calls of one scrub wren. They played the calls of an Australian fairy wren and the calls of a Chinese prinia. And you can see that the response to these were all very similar. And likewise, in China, they played at the nest of a prinia, line calls of a prinia, of a Chinese halo bird, and an Australian scrub wren, and pretty much got equivalent responses. So that implies that the response to these calls is pretty much a very deeply instinctive one. But despite this being a very instinctive response, learning to make the call turns out to be a learned process. And they found that birds that have never seen a cuckoo do not produce the sound even when exposed to a cuckoo. They only learn to produce the call after hearing other birds make it in the presence of the cuckoo. And this image shows one of their experiments with a stuffed cuckoo. And they had to put it in a cage because the birds would get so furious that they would tear it apart. So there's some splendid fairy wrens attacking it and winding away, I think so. Okay, so in conclusion, this whine vocalization turns out to be a universal word that means cuckoo or brood parasite. It results in a remarkable degree of cross-species cooperation. It elicits a strong innate response, but it has to be learned. So, was Darwin correct about language? Maybe. Stay tuned.